In September of 1978, the quiet southern Alaskan town of Sterling became the epicenter of a chilling mystery that would decimate an entire community, an enduring story that continues to perplex investigators over 4 decades later. This is the story of Scott and Amy Fandel, 2 siblings who disappeared without a trace from their family's cabin, leaving behind a few eerie clues, along with numerous unanswered questions. The night of September 5th, 1978 began innocently enough. 13-year-old Scott and 8-year-old Amy joined their mother Margaret and their visiting aunt Kathy for a special outing at Good Time Charlie's, a local bar and restaurant. It was supposed to be an evening of fun, a chance to eat out and catch up with family. But as the night went on, the children grew restless. They weren't interested in the chatter of adults or the hum of the bar. Like most kids, they wanted to play. After a little persuasion, Margaret and Kathy decided to drop Scott and Amy back off at the family's cabin at around 10 p.m. before they returned to the bar. It might sound unusual today, but in the tight-knit community of Sterling, this was actually a common practice. Neighbors were like extended family, and doors to homes were rarely locked. Once home, the siblings didn't stay inside for long. They headed next door to play with their neighbors' children, but by 11:45 p.m., they decided to call it a night and return to their cabin. A neighbor later confirmed seeing the cabin's light on, a small detail that would take on greater significance later. It's also important to note that Alaska's unique geography often leads to unconventional routines. With its long summer days where the sun can linger well into evening hours, residents often hold stranger hours than those in more southern regions. This could explain why the children's evening activities didn't seem out of place at the time. Margaret and Kathy eventually returned home between 2 and 3 a.m. on the morning of September 6th. As they approached the cabin, something felt off. The entire house was dark, which was a strange sight, given that both Scott and Amy were terrified of the dark. Inside, Margaret found signs that Scott had been preparing a late-night snack. A pan of water sat on the stove, still warm, alongside a packet of macaroni and a can of tomatoes. It appeared as if the meal had been abandoned mid-preparation. Yet, Margaret wasn't immediately alarmed. She assumed her children had stayed the night at the neighbor's house, a perfectly reasonable conclusion in a community where kids often slept over without much notice. The next morning, Margaret left for work as usual, believing everything was fine. But that was far from the case. That afternoon, the neighbor's children stopped by the cabin, looking for Scott and Amy to play. The kids' Aunt Kathy, who was still at the house, was perplexed. She thought the siblings had spent the night next door. When Margaret was alerted, that's when panic set in. The kids hadn't shown up for school, and no one had seen or heard from them since the previous night. Margaret called the police, and that's when the search for Scott and Amy began. The Sterling community banded together with law enforcement to search for the missing siblings. They combed through dense Alaskan woods, enlisted sniffer dogs, and scoured every inch of the cabin. Yet no signs of Scott or Amy ever surfaced. Their coats and shoes remained inside the cabin, and their beds were untouched, as if they'd never even tried to sleep the night before. No struggle, no footprints, no blood. And that lack of evidence left investigators grasping at straws. How could 2 children disappear without leaving a single trace? And as the small number of leads that authorities had dried up, that's when speculation took hold. One theory pointed to someone possibly overhearing Margaret and Kathy at Good Time Charlie's. Could a stranger have learned that the children would be home alone? If so, this could have given them the perfect opportunity to act. Another theory was far more personal. Suspicion fell on the children's father, Roger Fandel. He and Margaret had endured a bitter divorce, and Roger had moved to Arizona afterward. While he flew back to Alaska to assist in the search, some people, including Margaret's brother, believed that he was involved in the abduction. Years later, a woman who had claimed to be Roger's girlfriend at the time said that she could reveal the truth about Scott and Amy for $5,000. Nothing came of her offer, and Roger was never charged with anything. Other theories were far less plausible, but no less chilling. Some suggested that the children had wandered off into the wilderness, but their familiarity with the area made this unlikely. Others speculated they'd fallen victim to a wild animal, but as stated before, there was no blood, no torn clothing, and no such evidence to support this claim. We won't give much shine to the more outlandish theories, but whispers of UFOs or abduction by something not of this world certainly were out there. Despite exhaustive efforts, the case eventually went cold, where it has stayed for decades. The search for the young brother and sister was called off way back in 1978, and the story of Scott and Amy faded from the headlines, becoming an unsettling footnote in Alaskan history. Today, now over 40 years later, the disappearance of Scott and Amy Fandel remains one of Alaska's greatest mysteries. Theories continue to circulate, but no new evidence has ever been uncovered. Those who knew the siblings are left to wonder, did someone in their close-knit community betray them? Did a stranger exploit a lapse in vigilance? Or was it something even more sinister that occurred that night? Whoever holds the answers, even if they're still alive, has remained silent up to this point. And so the tragic story of Scott and Amy Fandel lingers, leaving behind a mystery that continues to captivate and trouble all of those who learn about it. The disappearance of 16-year-old Allie Lowitzer is one of those cases that just leaves you guessing. On a seemingly normal spring afternoon in 2010, Allie stepped off her school bus, planning to walk a short distance to her part-time job at a nearby burger barn. It was a walk she'd made countless times before, but on this particular day, Allie never made it to her destination. And in the years since, no one has been able to uncover the truth about what happened during that fateful walk. April 26, 2010, began like any other day for 16-year-old Allie Lowitzer of Spring, Texas. The high school sophomore, known for her love of art and softball, attended her classes as usual. After school, she called her mother, Joanne, to ask permission to stop by the burger barn. She wanted to pick up her paycheck and to see if she could take on a shift that evening. Joanne agreed. The restaurant was only a few minutes away from their house, and it was broad daylight. Allie got off her bus just before 2:30 p.m. at her usual stop, along with 3 other teenagers. As the others walked ahead, Allie lagged behind, texting on her phone. By 2:57 p.m., she sent her last known message to a friend. From that moment on, Allie's never been seen again. When Allie didn't make it home that evening, her mother assumed that she was working late. Joanne expected Allie to call for a ride once her shift ended. But when 8 p.m. rolled around, with no word from her daughter, worry began to settle. Messages to Allie's phone went unanswered, and by 9 p.m., Joanne drove down to the burger barn herself. And to her horror, the restaurant was closed and locked up tight. The lights were off, and Allie was nowhere to be found. Joanne's sense of dread deepened as she called family members and Allie's friends, but no one had seen or heard from her. She then contacted law enforcement, only to be met with a frustrating lack of urgency. Officers suggested that Allie might have run away, a conclusion that her family strongly disagreed with. Allie had no reason to leave. All of her belongings, including her cherished art supplies, were untouched in her room, and she hadn't even made it to the burger barn to collect her paycheck. Despite her family's insistence that something terrible had happened, the initial investigation moved slowly. Law enforcement's assumption that Allie was a runaway meant crucial hours were wasted. The following day, Joanne contacted the Laura Recovery Center, a nonprofit dedicated to finding missing children. The organization quickly arranged search efforts, distributing flyers and rallying volunteers to comb through the surrounding area. But those searches yielded no clues. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation faltered. Witnesses from the neighborhood reported nothing unusual. The boys who had exited the bus with Allie were questioned, but provided no leads. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses showed no sign of her. Even Allie's cell phone offered little insight. Its last known location was near her home, but it stopped transmitting signals shortly after she vanished. With no evidence and no witnesses, theories about Allie's disappearance began to circulate. The idea that Allie was snatched by an opportunistic predator gained a lot of traction. Her route from the bus stop to the burger barn was short, but not heavily trafficked, making it possible for someone with ill intent to intercept her without drawing any attention. Spring, Texas also sits near several major highways, a fact that has fueled speculation about human trafficking. If Allie was targeted for such a purpose, she could have been quickly transported out of the area. Another possibility is that Allie was taken by someone familiar to her. The lack of any signs of struggle might suggest she willingly approached her abductor, unaware of their motives. And finally, some have wondered if Allie could have had an accident on her way to the burger barn. What takes away from this theory, though, is that searches of the area turned up no evidence to support it. There were no signs of injuries, no discarded belongings, and no clues to indicate that she'd ever been in distress. For Allie's family, the 14 years since her disappearance have been marked by heartbreak and determination. Joanne Lowitzer became a relentless advocate for her daughter, refusing to let the case fade from public memory. She quit her job to focus on the search and maintained the website alexandrialowitzer.com in order to share updates and gather tips. Every year on Allie's birthday, the family holds vigils to honor her and remind the world that she's still out there somewhere. Joanne's efforts have not been without pain. Over the years, false leads and cruel hoaxes have brought moments of hope that quickly turned to despair. One such instance, a tip suggested that Allie had been spotted in Ohio, but that turned out to be a dead end. Another cruel twist came when someone demanded money in exchange for information about Allie, only to be exposed as a fraud. This lack of closure has left a heavy burden on Allie's loved ones. While her family believes she was abducted, they remain open to any possibility that could explain her disappearance. Advances in forensic technology offer a glimmer of hope that one day, new evidence might surface. Age progression photos have been created to show what Allie might look like today. Joanne believes that someone out there knows what happened to her daughter, whether it's a witness who has yet to come forward, or even the perpetrator carrying the weight of their crime. The truth is still out there, as well as the answer to the question, what really happened to Allie Lowitzer on that April afternoon? The disappearance of Allie Lowitzer feels like a puzzle waiting to be solved, and hopefully not a story destined to fade into obscurity. For every year that passes without answers, the likelihood of finding her alive does diminish. Her family, though determined, faces the cold reality that they may never know what happened to their loved one. Allie's absence has become a painful void that time cannot fill, a name that lingers in quiet sorrow rather than resolution. For now, her story remains uncertain, with the truth buried somewhere that no one has yet thought to look. It was August of 2004 when 40-year-old Marianne Carver, a former investment banker turned poet, made a choice that would forever leave her family searching for answers. Without telling a soul, Marianne booked herself a last-minute ticket on the luxurious celebrity cruises ship, Mercury. The 7-day voyage along Alaska's scenic coastline promised relaxation, solitude, and inspiration for her writing. But unfortunately, Marianne would never return home. Marianne boarded her cruise in Seattle, Washington on August 28, 2004. Surveillance footage confirmed her arrival, and she seemed well on her way to settling into her cabin and enjoying her trip. On the first night, everything appeared normal, but by the very next day, Marianne was gone. The room steward noticed early on that something was amiss. Marianne's bed was untouched, her belongings undisturbed, and there was no sign of her ever returning to the cabin. Concerned, the steward reported this to his supervisor. Over the next 5 days, the steward raised the alarm repeatedly, but each time, he was told to drop it and focus on his job. Despite the glaring evidence that something was wrong, no one on the ship took any action. No announcement was made, no search was conducted, and when the Mercury finally docked a week later, Mary Ann's belongings were boxed up and donated to charity, as if she had simply never existed. Back home in Massachusetts, Mary Ann's 13-year-old daughter became increasingly worried when her mother failed to call or check in. The two were close, and Mary Ann never went more than a few days without reaching out. That's when the teenager turned to her grandfather, Kendall Carver, for help. Kendall, an experienced and determined man, quickly realized something had gone terribly wrong. Unable to contact Mary Ann, he reported her missing to the local police. Investigators traced her movements through bank records and discovered she had purchased a ticket for the Mercury. But that is where the trail ended. When Kendall contacted Celebrity Cruises for information, he was met with resistance. It took the company 3 days to confirm that Mary Ann had indeed even boarded the ship. Beyond that, they offered little to no details. They claimed to have no record of whether she disembarked, no relevant CCTV footage, and no explanation for what might have happened during the trip. Frustrated and heartbroken, Kendall hired a private investigator to dig deeper. What the investigator uncovered was shocking. The steward who had noticed Mary Ann's absence had reported it daily for 5 days, but his supervisor had ignored the warnings. Worse, the ship's CCTV footage, potentially the key to unraveling the mystery, had been automatically erased after 72 hours. The cruise line's handling of Mary Ann's disappearance was riddled with negligence. They failed to alert authorities when she was first reported missing. They discarded her belongings, destroying potential evidence, and they made no effort to contact her family after realizing she hadn't left the ship with the other passengers. These lapses not only stalled the investigation, but also left the Carver family in a state of torment. Kendall later remarked that the lack of basic accountability felt like an added betrayal. But Kendall Carver wasn't willing to let his daughter's disappearance be swept under the rug. He founded the International Cruise Victims Association in 2006, a nonprofit dedicated to advocating for stricter regulations and passenger safety while aboard cruise ships. Through relentless efforts, Kendall helped bring about significant changes in maritime law. In 2010, the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act was signed into law. This legislation required cruise lines to report crimes and missing persons promptly and mandated the preservation of CCTV footage. While these measures may have come too late for Mary Ann, they have since helped protect countless others. Just over 2 decades later, the mystery of Mary Ann Carver remains unsolved. With no physical evidence, no witness testimony, and no clear answers as to what happened, the case has reached a standstill. Her family is left to wonder, was she the victim of foul play? Did she perhaps take her own life? Or did something else entirely happen during that first night away at sea? Mary Ann's disappearance is a stark example of how easily someone can vanish in an environment where accountability is scarce. For her family, the loss is only compounded by the knowledge that crucial evidence had been erased, and opportunities to uncover the truth went along with it. Kendall Carver passed away in 2019 without ever learning what happened to his daughter. Yet his fight for justice has left a mark on the cruise industry. The reforms he championed may one day prevent another family from having to endure the same pain that he did. Mary Ann Carver's story remains a mystery. As the years pass, the chances of uncovering the truth grow slimmer. But for her family, the memory of her vibrant spirit endures, even as the answers they seek seem to remain just out of reach.